Winter of 1944, Italy. The Allies, after a successful landing in Sicily and the mainland, were advancing north, toward the coveted Rome. It seemed victory was near, but their path was blocked by the most powerful German defensive line, the Gustav Line. And at its heart, like an impregnable bastion, stood Monte Cassino, with its ancient Benedictine monastery. This was not just a battle. It was 4 months of hell, 4 months of fierce fighting that are forever etched in history as one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. It was here that the fate of the Italian campaign was decided. Why did this seemingly modest mountain become such an insurmountable obstacle? And how did the path to the ancient capital lie precisely through this rocky landscape? The answers lie in the strategic genius of German engineers and the unparalleled courage of soldiers on both sides. The strategic importance of Monte Cassino cannot be overstated. It was not just a monastery atop a mountain. It was the cornerstone of the German Gustav Line, the heart of an impregnable fortress that blocked the path to Rome. Imagine the narrow Liri River valley, through which the only road north ran, was squeezed between steep cliffs. And precisely above this valley, at a height of 520 meters, rose Monte Cassino. From its summit, there was a complete view for tens of kilometers around, allowing German observers to control any movement of Allied forces. Any attempt to advance through the valley or bypass the mountain would be immediately noticed and met with a hail of fire. The Germans, with their meticulous precision, turned this natural fortress into a veritable hell for the attackers. The monastery, founded in 529 by Saint Benedict, became not only a symbol of spirituality, but also a strategically important point. Its thick, centuries-old walls fit perfectly into the defensive system. Of course, the Germans officially declared the monastery a neutral zone, but practically used it and the surrounding heights as observation posts and firing positions. The slopes of the mountain were crisscrossed with trenches, dugouts, machine gun nests, and mined with thousands of mines. Every fold of the terrain, every stone, was turned into part of the defense. The Germans didn't just dig in, they grew into this mountain, making it a part of their body. Mount Cairo, dominating Monte Cassino from the north, and the mountains bordering the valley from the south, created a multi-layered, echeloned defense. To reach Rome, the Allies didn't just have to fight soldiers. They had to overcome nature itself, fortified by the genius of German military engineering. It was a battle not only for territory, but also for every meter of height, for every dominating point from which the valley could be controlled. Monte Cassino became a symbol of resistance, an obstacle that was to stop the Allied advance at all costs. And it, a silent witness to the centuries, fulfilled its role with tragic effectiveness. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces on the Italian front, was not merely a talented strategist. He was a master of defensive battles, capable of transforming any landscape into an impregnable fortress. And the Gustav Line became his masterpiece. It was not just a strip of fortifications, but an entire system, woven into the mountainous terrain, utilizing every height, every river barrier to its advantage. The Germans did not build it in haste. It was a premeditated and meticulously implemented concept. The line's foundation consisted of 3 deeply echeloned defensive belts, each including bunkers, pillboxes, and machine gun nests, connected by trenches. All of this was dug into rocky soil, often reinforced with concrete, and camouflaged so effectively that detection from the air was virtually impossible. Particular attention was paid to artillery. German batteries were positioned on dominant heights, from which all approaches to the line were swept with fire. They could deliver crossfire, creating true quote for the attackers. Artillery positions were carefully camouflaged, and guns were quickly moved after firing to avoid counter-battery fire. Minefields are a separate story. Thousands, if not tens of thousands, of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines were laid in all possible attack directions. They were not only in open areas but also in forests, on mountain slopes, and on roads. Often, mines were laid in several layers, with tripwires and booby traps hidden beneath them. Demining became a deadly and extremely slow task. Engineering structures included not only mines and fortifications. The Germans skillfully used natural obstacles, blowing up bridges, creating roadblocks, and orchestrating artificial floods in valleys to slow the Allied advance. Every path, every ravine, was turned into a potential trap. Kesselring understood that in mountainous terrain, the numerical superiority of the enemy was neutralized. His tactic was to maximize the advantages of the terrain, forcing the Allies to launch frontal assaults on well-fortified positions, where every meter was gained at the cost of heavy casualties. He positioned his troops in such a way that they could be quickly redeployed to threatened sectors, and kept reserves ready for counterattacks. German soldiers were excellently trained in mountain defensive warfare. They knew every fold of the terrain, every rock that could be used for cover. Many of them were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened in the most brutal battles. The Gustav Line became the embodiment of German military discipline and engineering ingenuity. It was designed not merely as an obstacle, but as a meat grinder, capable of crushing any army that dared to touch it. And Monte Cassino, with its dominant position, was the heart of this defensive system, ready to absorb the first blow. The Allies were about to learn that the path to Rome lay not through an easy stroll, but through a true hell created by one of the Second World War's most cunning and ruthless strategists. Against this impregnable defense, two enormous forces stood opposed. The Allies, under the command of American General Mark Clark and British General Harold Alexander, were a gigantic international conglomerate. Their troop strength, concentrated for the breakthrough of the Gustav Line, reached approximately 150,000 men, organized into the American 5th and British 8th Armies. Morale was mixed. On one hand, there was euphoria from successful landings and advances through Italy. On the other, increasing fatigue from prolonged battles in extremely difficult conditions. American units, especially those that had already passed through Sicily and southern Italy, were experienced, but their commands sometimes suffered from excessive overconfidence and a lack of experience in mountain warfare. British troops, including veterans of desert campaigns, were known for their resilience, but they too faced an entirely new type of landscape and defense. However, the Allies were not represented solely by these two nations. French expeditionary forces, consisting of North African goumiers, known for their endurance and skills in mountainous terrain, fought in their ranks. There were also New Zealanders, Indian units, including the famous Gurkhas with their fierce kukris, and even the Polish Second Corps, whose soldiers had passed through the hell of Soviet camps and burned with a desire for revenge. Each contingent brought its unique experience, its traditions, and its motivation, creating a kaleidoscope of languages and cultures on the front line. The Germans, under the leadership of Field Marshal Kesselring, had significantly fewer forces, about 30,000 men, but their positions were almost invulnerable. These were mostly veterans, hardened in battle, with high morale and a fanatical belief in their defense. They knew that the fate of the entire Italian campaign depended on their steadfastness. The planning of the first assault, which was to begin in January 1944, was fraught with serious disagreements between American and British command. The British, more cautious, proposed longer preparation and a massive application of artillery and aviation. The Americans, including General Clark, insisted on an earlier assault, aiming to break through to Rome as quickly as possible. Their plan involved a frontal attack across the Rapido River Valley, forcing the water barrier, and a subsequent assault on the mountains. This was a direct, but extremely risky approach. French units were to attack on the right flank, attempting to bypass Monte Cassino from the east. The New Zealanders and Indians were preparing for subsequent stages of the operation, but already understood that they would face a true hell. Allied command underestimated the depth and power of the German defense, as well as the determination of the German soldiers. They believed that a massive attack could break through the Gustav Line. But the mountains of Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line were ready for the encounter. And this encounter promised to become one of the bloodiest pages of World War II. January 1944. The time had come for the first act of this bloody drama. The Allied command, urged on by American General Mark Clark, decided on a frontal assault. The task was set for the American troops to cross the Rapido River and break through the Gustav Line. The Rapido River, though not wide, was a treacherous obstacle. Its icy waters, swollen by winter rains, flowed swiftly. The Germans, of course, did not miss the opportunity to turn it into part of their defense. The banks were mined, and machine gun nests, located on commanding heights, kept every meter of the crossing under their sights. On January 17th, the American 36th Infantry Division, consisting mainly of Texas Guardsmen, began its attempt. Under cover of night, they moved towards the river, hoping for surprise. But German intelligence was not asleep. As soon as the first boats touched the water, hell broke loose. Machine guns opened a hail of fire. Artillery began zeroing in on pre-scouted positions. Soldiers fell into the cold waters of the Rapido, never reaching the opposite bank. Engineering units tried to build pontoon bridges, but they were immediately destroyed by German artillery. For several days, American soldiers made desperate attempts to cross the river. Each attempt resulted in new losses. The Germans, entrenched in their concrete fortifications, were virtually invulnerable. They methodically shot down the attackers, preventing them from establishing a foothold. The mountainous terrain, which had to be stormed after crossing the river, proved no less deadly. Every stone, every rock outcrop served as natural cover for the Germans. The Americans, lacking experience in mountain warfare, suffered from the cold, lack of supplies, and constant nervous tension. Battles raged for every height, for every ravine. Hand-to-hand combat was commonplace. Between January 17th and 24th, the Americans lost more than 2,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. Their attacks faltered, never achieving their main goal, a breakthrough of the Gustav Line. The reasons for the failure were obvious: underestimation of the enemy, insufficient preparation for an assault on such a powerful defensive line, especially in mountainous conditions, and of course, the lack of support from other Allied units, which were supposed to divert German reserves. The command realized that a frontal assault on well-fortified positions in such conditions was tantamount to suicide. It was clear that a breakthrough would require more than just the courage of the soldiers. New tactical solutions, massive artillery and air support, and closer coordination between all Allied forces were needed. The lessons of the first assault were bitter, but necessary. They showed that the Battle of Monte Cassino would be long and bloody, and that the Germans would not give up their positions without the fiercest resistance. Ahead of us lies an attempt at an outflanking maneuver, which was supposed to turn the tide of the battle. After the failure of the first assault, it became clear: a frontal attack on the Gustav Line was suicide. The Allied command, unaccustomed to such losses, sought another path, and it was found: a naval strike into the enemy's rear. The operation was codenamed '0' and involved an amphibious landing in the Anzio area, a small port town south of Rome. The idea was simple and brilliant: bypass the Gustav Line, land troops in the undefended German rear, cut off their communications, and then, linking up with the main forces, take Rome. This was a chance to turn the tide of the Italian campaign with one powerful blow. On January 22, 1944, under cover of darkness, Allied ships approached the shores of Anzio. On board were about 50,000 soldiers and 5,000 vehicles, mostly American and British units. The landing went surprisingly smoothly. The Germans, not expecting such a maneuver, were caught off guard. Resistance was minimal. The first echelons of troops easily secured the beachhead, encountering no serious opposition. Lieutenant General John Lucas, commander of the U.S. 6th Corps, who was to lead the offensive, received a clear order: advance deep into the territory, capture strategically important objectives, and pose a threat to Rome. But it was here that the first miscalculations began. Instead of developing the success and rapidly advancing, Lucas decided to fortify the beachhead. He feared a German counterattack, not knowing that at that moment, Kesselring simply did not have sufficient reserves for an immediate response. Precious hours, and then days, were lost digging trenches, setting up wire fences, and organizing defenses. This was a fatal mistake. The Germans, recovering from the shock, quickly realized the scale of the threat. Field Marshal Kesselring, demonstrating his strategic genius, began to pull troops from all directions. He understood. If the Anzio beachhead was not contained, the fate of the entire Italian campaign would be decided. Within a few days, 8 divisions, including elite parachute and armored units, were transferred to Anzio. The Germans created a second line of defense, the so-called quote 1, around the beachhead, turning it into a besieged fortress. The slowness of the Allied command in Anzio became a byword. Instead of striking while the Germans were disoriented, the Allies gave them time to regroup and organize their defenses. The missed opportunities were enormous. If Lucas had followed the original plan and moved on Rome, the city could have been captured as early as late January. This would not only have hastened the end of the campaign in Italy, but also would have relieved the front at Monte Cassino, where fierce fighting was taking place at the time. But history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood. Operation Shingle, which was supposed to be a brilliant bypass, turned into a protracted and bloody confrontation. The Anzio beachhead found itself trapped, and Allied troops had to endure the heaviest fighting just to hold their positions. Instead of bypassing the Gustav line, they created a second front that itself was under siege. Kesselring, seeing the enemy's indecision, immediately took advantage of it, turning Anzio into a veritable meat grinder. The Battle of Anzio became another proof that in war, time is the most valuable resource, and delay can cost not only lives but entire campaigns. The failure of the first assault and the bogged-down Operation Shingle in Anzio forced the Allied command to seek new solutions. Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the New Zealand Corps, proposed his plan. His battle-hardened troops were to attack Monte Cassino from the northwest, while the Indian 4th Infantry Division would attack from the southeast. This was the second assault, and its beginning was marked by one of the most controversial decisions of the entire campaign. On February 15, 1944, the sky over Monte Cassino darkened with hundreds of bombers. American aircraft dropped over 1,200 tons of high-explosive bombs on the ancient Benedictine monastery. The goal was to destroy the German soldiers allegedly entrenched there. The Allied command claimed that the monastery was being used by the Germans as an observation post and a strongpoint. However, as it later turned out, there were no German troops inside the monastery at that time. The Germans, true to their tactics, held positions on the mountain slopes, using natural cover and pre-prepared positions. The decision to bomb sparked a storm of criticism worldwide. The monastery, founded in the 6th century, was one of the oldest and most revered centers of Christian culture in Europe. Its destruction became not only a tragedy for history and art, but also a strategic mistake. Instead of easing the task for the assaulting forces, the bombing only complicated it. The ruins of the monastery, whose once magnificent walls were mostly intact, now turned into piles of stones, rubble, and dust. These debris became ideal cover for German paratroopers from the 1st Parachute Division, who immediately occupied new positions among the ruins. The thick walls, which could have been penetrated by artillery before, now became a chaotic labyrinth where every stone could conceal a sniper or a machine gunner. Inside the ruins, the Germans dug new trenches and dugouts, using the debris as natural barriers. This created an extremely effective defensive position, almost invulnerable to artillery fire and airstrikes. On February 16th, the day after the bombing, New Zealand and Indian troops launched their attack. They had to contend not only with fierce German resistance, but also with difficult terrain, littered with debris and obstructions. Every meter of advance was gained with enormous difficulty. The New Zealanders, moving uphill, met with heavy fire from the monastery ruins and the adjacent heights. Indian units, including the famous Gurkhas, attacked from the other side, but also encountered an impenetrable wall of fire. The fighting was incredibly fierce. Soldiers fought in conditions of complete chaos amidst the ruins, where every stone could be a deadly trap. The Germans, knowing the terrain perfectly and using every advantage, repelled one attack after another. By February 18, it became clear that the second assault, like the first, was doomed to fail. Allied forces, having suffered heavy losses, were forced to retreat. The destruction of the monastery, instead of opening the road to Rome, only strengthened German positions, transforming a cultural heritage into a symbol of senseless brutality and tactical error. The decision to bomb Monte Cassino on February 15, 1944, became one of the most tragic mistakes of World War II. But why was it made? Allied command, particularly General Mark Clark and General Bernard Freyberg, were convinced that the Germans were using the ancient monastery as an observation post and a strongpoint. Intelligence gathered from the air showed the presence of German positions on the slopes of the mountain, but not inside the monastery itself. However, in the heat of battle, under the pressure of failures and immense losses, the command decided to act on the principle that it was better to be safe than sorry. The arguments were simple. The monastery dominated the entire valley, and from its height, the Germans could adjust artillery fire, and the thick walls, according to the Allies, served as ideal protection for the defenders. Reports also came in from soldiers who allegedly saw German soldiers inside the monastery, although this was later not confirmed. It was decided that the destruction of the monastery would demoralize the enemy and facilitate advancement. But the world reacted differently. The Vatican expressed deep outrage, calling the bombing a barbaric act against humanity's cultural heritage. Pope Pius XII personally condemned the destruction of the sanctuary. The international community, especially Catholics, was shocked. The Allies faced a wave of criticism that undermined their moral authority. The saddest thing is that the bombing did not bring the expected military result. As we have already said, there were no Germans inside the monastery. They occupied positions on the slopes, and after the building was destroyed, paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division immediately occupied the ruins. The debris turned into ideal shelters, creating a complex labyrinth where every stone could hide an enemy. Instead of opening the way, the bombing only strengthened the enemy's defenses, making them even more impregnable. This controversial decision became a vivid example of how, in times of war, strategic miscalculations can have not only military, but also deep moral and cultural consequences, leaving an unhealing wound in history. After 2 unsuccessful assaults and the tragic bombing of the monastery, the Allied command did not give up. The path to Rome still lay through Monte Cassino. It was evident that new approaches were needed. The third assault, codenamed December, was planned for mid-March 1944. Its goal was to finally break the German defenses. This time, the emphasis was on the massive use of all available resources and new tactics. The main strike force once again consisted of troops from the New Zealand Corps, reinforced by Indian Gurkhas and fresh British units. The command understood that frontal attacks on the monastery ruins were pointless. Therefore, the plan envisioned a two-phase offensive. First, on March 15th, a powerful aerial and artillery strike was to suppress German firing points and demoralize the enemy. Then, under the cover of this fire curtain, the infantry was to break through the ruined streets of Cassino, located at the foot of the mountain, and capture the key heights surrounding the monastery. For the first time in the history of the Italian campaign, the Allies employed such a large-scale aerial preparatory bombardment. More than 500 bombers dropped thousands of tons of bombs on the city of Cassino and German positions on the mountain slopes. The ground literally trembled, the air filled with roaring and dust. Artillery followed the Air Force. Hundreds of guns fired at pre-scouted targets, creating a wall of fire. It seemed that nothing living could survive in this hell. However, as is often the case in war, even such massive strikes did not bring the desired effect. The destruction was colossal, but German paratroopers, battle-hardened and perfectly familiar with the terrain, took cover in deep bunkers and tunnels dug beneath the city's ruins. When the bombing ended, they quickly occupied their positions and prepared to meet the advancing forces. British and Indian units, supported by tanks, began the offensive on Cassino. The fighting in the city was incredibly fierce. Every building turned into a mini fortress, every intersection into a deadly trap. Tanks got stuck in the rubble, and the infantry suffered huge losses from sniper fire and machine guns. The Indian Gurkhas, known for their bravery and hand-to-hand combat skills, particularly distinguished themselves. With their curved knives, kukris, they repeatedly engaged in skirmishes with the Germans, demonstrating unparalleled courage. The New Zealanders, in turn, tried to bypass the city by attacking positions on the mountain slopes. But here, too, fierce resistance awaited them. German paratroopers, despite the bombings, maintained their morale and fought to the last. The battles continued for 10 days, until March 25th. The Allies managed to capture part of the city of Cassino, but they failed to break through the defenses and take the monastery. Losses were enormous on both sides. The reasons for the failure were complex. Firstly, the terrain in the ruined city hindered the advance of tanks and infantry support. Secondly, even such a massive fire strike could not completely destroy the fortified German positions. And finally, the unparalleled courage and resilience of the German paratroopers, who fought with fanatical determination, preventing the enemy from gaining a foothold on the key heights. The third assault on Monte Cassino, despite enormous efforts and new tactical approaches, again ended in failure. The battle for this impregnable bastion continued, claiming new lives and leaving a bitter taste of despair. 3 assaults on Monte Cassino faltered, leaving behind mountains of corpses and ruins. But what lay behind these numbers? What was the price of every meter, every day in that hell? The daily life of a soldier, be he a German paratrooper, an American infantryman, or a New Zealand sapper, was filled with unbearable trials. The winter of 1944 in central Italy proved harsh. Torrential rains turned mountain trails into an impassable mess of mud and rocks. The cold permeated to the bone. Soldiers slept in damp trenches, dugouts, or simply under the open sky, covered by ponchos. Frostbite was common. Medical support was catastrophic. The wounded were difficult to evacuate along mountain trails under constant fire. Often they had to wait for help for hours, or even days. German paratroopers, trapped at the summit, suffered from supply problems. Food and ammunition were delivered under the cover of night, risking Allied artillery fire. The Allies, though better supplied, also faced difficulties. Roads were destroyed, and trucks often got stuck in the mud. The psychological state of the soldiers was at its limit. Constant artillery shelling, sniper fire, minefields, all this created unbearable tension. General Harold Alexander, commander of the Allied forces, later recalled that these battles were the toughest he had ever seen. Many soldiers suffered from shell shock, a severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. They lost touch with reality, tormented by nightmares. One American soldier, Sergeant Bill Mike, recalled, "Every day was a struggle, not only with the Germans, but with myself. Fear was our constant companion." German soldiers, despite their desperate situation, showed incredible resilience. They were perfectly trained and fanatically believed in their defense. Corporal Hans Mueller, a paratrooper, wrote in his diary, "We knew that if Monte Cassino fell, the road to Rome would be open. We could not allow that." Their desperate resistance was fueled not only by discipline, but also by an understanding of the strategic importance of their position. On both sides, soldiers found solace in camaraderie. Shared suffering brought people closer, creating unbreakable bonds. They shared their last piece of bread, supported each other in moments of despair. Soldiers' memories often boil down to one thing: endless cold, hunger, fear, and a sense of utter hopelessness. One New Zealand soldier who survived said, "I don't know how we endured it. We just fought for life every day." The Battle of Monte Cassino became a symbol of the senseless brutality of war, where every day was a struggle for survival, and human life was valued no more than a cartridge. And yet, despite all the horrors, people continued to fight, driven by order, duty, or simply the instinct of self-preservation. 3 assaults on Monte Cassino had failed, leaving behind mountains of corpses and ruins. The Allies, despite enormous losses and moral exhaustion, could not retreat. Rome awaited, and the path to it lay only through this impregnable bastion. After the failure of the third assault, it became clear that a radical revision of strategy was necessary. It was then that the idea of Operation Diadem was born, the fourth decisive offensive, which was to finally break the German defenses. This was the last attempt, the last chance to break through the Gustav Line and open the road to Rome. The Allied command underwent serious changes. General Harold Alexander, commander of the 15th Army Group, was given broader powers, ensuring closer coordination between the American 5th and British 8th Armies. General Mark Clark, commanding the 5th Army, was forced to admit that his previous tactical decisions had led to enormous losses. Now, under pressure from Alexander, he had to act more cohesively. For the first time in the entire Italian campaign, the Allies decided to assemble truly colossal forces. For Operation Diadem, 20 divisions were gathered, totaling about 300,000 men, as well as 1,500 tanks and 4,000 artillery pieces. More than 3,500 aircraft were to control the skies over Italy. This was an unprecedented concentration of firepower and manpower. The Germans, though significantly outnumbered, had their positions fortified to the limit, and their morale remained high. The planning of Diadem was detailed and multifaceted. This time, the Allies decided not just to attack head-on, but to use a complex, comprehensive approach. The main thrust was to be along the Liri Valley, with flanking attacks on Monte Cassino and the surrounding heights. The new plan envisioned not one, but several coordinated attacks that were to develop simultaneously. The British 8th Army, reinforced by Canadian and Polish units, was to break through the Liri Valley, while the American 5th Army, including French, Brazilian, and Indian units, was to attack on the western flank along the coast. A special role was assigned to the Polish 2nd Corps, which was to strike directly at Monte Cassino. Tactical decisions were carefully thought out. New methods for overcoming minefields and engineering obstacles were developed. Artillery was to maintain continuous fire, suppressing German strongpoints and creating corridors for infantry advancement. Aviation was to provide continuous air support, attacking German reserves and communications. Coordination between the various national contingents was key. British, American, French, Polish, Indian, Canadian, New Zealand, and South African troops were to act as a single organism. Numerous meetings were held, and detailed maps and interaction plans were developed. Every soldier knew their task. Operation Diadem was to begin on May 11, 1944. The Allies understood that this would be the bloodiest battle of the campaign, but there was no other way. The stakes were incredibly high. Not only the capture of Rome, but also the morale of the entire Allied army was at stake. The whole world watched with bated breath as preparations were made for this grand offensive. On May 11, 1944, as night fell over Monte Cassino, the final decisive assault began. Operation Diadem entered its phase. This time, the main striking force on the most difficult sector of the front, directly against the monastery, was the 2nd Polish Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders. For many of these soldiers, it was not just a battle, but a settling of scores with fate. Many of them had passed through the hell of Soviet camps, through Siberia and Central Asia, before finding themselves in the ranks of the Allies. Their motivation was incredibly strong. They fought not only for the freedom of Italy, but also for their own, for the liberation of Poland, for the memory of those who did not survive Stalin's repressions. These were people who had nothing to lose but their lives, and who burned with the desire to prove their worth in the fight against a common enemy. The Polish Corps numbered about 50,000 men, and they were to attack positions that had proven impregnable 3 times for other Allied armies. The Germans, perfectly understanding the strategic importance of Monte Cassino, fortified their positions to the limit, using every fold of the terrain, every stone. The tactics of the Poles were carefully thought out. They abandoned frontal attacks, instead focusing on night operations and sudden assaults by small groups. They knew that in mountain warfare the advantage goes to those who know the terrain best and act covertly. On the night of May 11th to 12th, Polish units began a cautious advance. Allied artillery laid down powerful diversionary fire, but silence reigned in the sectors of the Polish offensive. The soldiers, moving along steep ravine-cut slopes, carried everything they needed: ammunition, water, provisions. Every step was taken with immense difficulty. On their way to the summit, they had to overcome minefields, barbed wire, and most importantly, the fierce resistance of German paratroopers. The fighting was incredibly brutal. In hand-to-hand combat, where there was no room for mercy, Polish soldiers showed unparalleled bravery. They used bayonets, sapper shovels, fists, anything that could help in close combat. Particularly fierce battles unfolded for Hill 593, which dominated the monastery. German paratroopers, the elite of the Wehrmacht, held on tenaciously, repelling one attack after another. Polish attacks were repelled, losses were colossal, but they did not give up. General Anders, seeing the scale of the losses, temporarily suspended the offensive to regroup. However, already on May 16th, after a short break and regrouping, the Poles resumed the assault. This time they acted even more decisively. Bypassing some heavily fortified positions, they attacked from unexpected directions. The heroic actions of individual units, fighting their way through fire and death, became legendary. On the morning of May 18, 1944, after 7 days of continuous fighting, Polish soldiers finally reached the summit of Monte Cassino. On May 17th, German paratroopers, realizing the hopelessness of further resistance and receiving no reinforcements, began to retreat. When a Polish patrol entered the ruins of the monastery, they found only a few wounded Germans. The Polish flag was raised over the ruins of Monte Cassino. It was not just a victory, it was a triumph of will, courage, and an indomitable spirit. The Battle of Monte Cassino, which lasted 4 months, was finally over. The road to Rome was open. Finally, after 4 months of bloody fighting, Monte Cassino was taken. The Polish flag, proudly flying over the ruins of the monastery, symbolized not only victory, but also a breakthrough. The Gustav Line, which seemed impregnable, had fallen. This event became a signal for the entire Allied army. On the morning of May 18, 1944, when the last pockets of resistance on Monte Cassino were suppressed, the Allies launched a massive offensive across the entire front. The British 8th Army, including Canadian and Indian units, poured into the Liri Valley, sweeping away the last German defensive lines. The American 5th Army, which included French expeditionary forces and Brazilian units, attacked on the western flank, along the coast. The Germans, having lost their key stronghold and finding themselves threatened with encirclement, began to retreat. This was not a panicked flight, but an organized withdrawal. Yet it was inevitable. Field Marshal Kesselring, realizing that holding the Gustav Line was no longer possible, ordered his troops to withdraw north, to a new defensive line, the Caesar Line, located closer to Rome. However, the retreat was difficult. Allied aviation, finally having gained air superiority, continuously bombed the retreating columns, destroying transport and disrupting communications. Artillery fired on roads and intersections, turning them into traps. The pursuit was relentless. Allied tanks and motorized infantry, freed from the shackles of the mountainous terrain, developed high speed. The Germans tried to organize rearguard actions to slow the enemy's advance, but their forces were depleted. Each day brought new kilometers of advance and new losses for the retreating forces. On May 23rd, just 5 days after the capture of Monte Cassino, what the Allied troops had long awaited happened. Finally, on May 18, 1944, after 4 months of continuous fighting, Polish soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of Monte Cassino. It seemed the goal was achieved, the path to Rome open. But what was the price of this victory? The answer to this question lies in the numbers, which, despite their dryness, are more eloquent than any words. The Battle of Monte Cassino became one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Allied forces, consisting of soldiers of 12 different nationalities, lost about 54,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. The Americans, who first stormed Rapido, paid for their mistakes with over 8,000 lives. British, New Zealand, and Indian units, who participated in the second and third assaults, lost another 23,000 men. The Polish Second Corps, which took the monastery, lost about 4,000 men, but their heroism is forever inscribed in history. These figures do not include the losses of French, Canadian, South African, and other contingents. German losses, according to various estimates, amounted to about 20,000 men. These were mainly elite parachute divisions, who fought with desperate bravery, holding their positions to the last. But behind every number stood a human life, cut short in terrible agony. A family that lost a son, father, or husband. This was not just a battle. It was a meat grinder, crushing human destinies. The question of the advisability of frontal assaults on the fortified positions of Monte Cassino, raised even during the battle, remains a subject of debate to this day. Many historians and military leaders agree that the Allied command, especially General Clark, insisted on direct assaults for too long, ignoring alternative strategic solutions. The Anzio operation, originally conceived as an outflanking maneuver, could have significantly accelerated the advance and reduced losses, had it not been for the slowness and indecisiveness of the command on the bridgehead. Instead of rapidly moving towards Rome, the forces at Anzio were tied down, and Kesselring gained time to transfer reserves, turning the bridgehead into another bloody arena. Perhaps if all Allied forces had been coordinated more effectively, and if more flexible tactical solutions had been applied, such colossal losses could have been avoided. Some experts believe that concentrating such a large number of troops on a narrow section of the front was a mistake, and that other ways of bypassing the Gustav Line should have been sought. However, despite all miscalculations and the enormous price, the Battle of Monte Cassino had a colossal impact on the further course of the war in Italy. It exhausted German reserves, tying up significant Wehrmacht forces that could have been used in other theaters of war, for example, on the Eastern Front, or in anticipation of the Normandy landing. After the breakthrough of the Gustav Line, the road to Rome was finally open, and the Allies entered the Eternal City on June 4, 1944. This was an important event that boosted Allied morale and became a symbol of their determination. But even after the fall of Rome, the war in Italy continued for almost another year, and the Italian campaign remained one of the toughest and most protracted. The Battle of Monte Cassino became a bitter lesson about the price of victory, about how human lives become small change in the great game of geopolitics. It reminds us of the courage and resilience of soldiers who fought in inhumane conditions, and of the importance of learning from the past, so as not to repeat its mistakes. Finally, on May 18, 1944, when the Polish flag flew over the ruins of Monte Cassino, the road to Rome was open. After 4 months of hell, superhuman efforts, and countless sacrifices, the Allies achieved victory, breaking through the seemingly impregnable Gustav Line. But this victory came at a price, and that price was incredibly high. The total Allied losses in the Battle of Monte Cassino amounted to about 54,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The Americans, who went through the bloody meat grinder of Rapido, lost more than 8,000 of their soldiers. British, New Zealand, and Indian units, which participated in subsequent assaults, suffered 23,000 casualties. The Polish Second Corps, which took the monastery, lost about 4,000 soldiers, but their heroism is forever inscribed in history. These figures do not include the losses of the French, Canadians, South Africans, and many others. The Germans, who heroically defended their fortifications, lost about 20,000 men, mostly elite paratroopers. Behind each of these figures lies a life cut short, unbearable pain, orphaned families. The Battle of Monte Cassino became a bitter lesson in how far strategic miscalculations can lead. Many historians and military commanders still debate the advisability of frontal assaults on fortified positions. Perhaps if the Anzio operation had been conducted more decisively, or if the Allies had used more flexible tactical solutions, such colossal losses could have been avoided. This battle showed that even with overwhelming numerical superiority, competent defense and the use of terrain can nullify the enemy's efforts. However, despite all the miscalculations and the enormous cost, the Battle of Monte Cassino had a colossal impact on the further course of the war in Italy. It depleted German reserves, tying up significant Wehrmacht forces that could have been used in other theaters of war. After breaching the Gustav Line, the Allies entered the Eternal City on June 4, 1944. This was an important event that boosted morale, but the war in Italy continued for almost another year. Monte Cassino is not just the name of a battle. It is a symbol of resilience, courage, and the tragic price of victory.